The world did not fall into war overnight. It was, a slow, creeping shadow that fell across the 1930s. The Great War, the one they said would end all wars, had left deep scars. Nations were broken, economies were in ruins. In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party rose to power on promises of restoring national pride. He spoke of a new German empire, a Third Reich, and blamed others for the country's problems. People were desperate. They were looking for answers. They listened. He rearmed the nation, a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles that had ended the First War. But the world, weary of conflict, watched and waited, hoping for peace. The silence of other nations was seen as a green light. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Then it demanded a piece of Czechoslovakia. Leaders from Britain and France met with Hitler in Munich. They chose a path they called appeasement. They gave him what he wanted, believing it would satisfy his ambition and prevent another catastrophic war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home, proclaiming he had secured peace for our time. But this peace was fragile, built on a false hope. Hitler's promises were empty. He had no intention of stopping. The storm clouds were not dispersing. They were gathering, growing darker and more menacing with each passing day. In Asia, another power was on the move. The Empire of Japan had its own imperial ambitions. It sought to dominate the Pacific and mainland Asia, creating what it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The fighting was brutal. The world read headlines about the atrocities in cities like Nanking. But the international community was distracted by the growing crisis in Europe. Two separate conflicts on two opposite sides of the globe were simmering. They were fueled by a similar hunger for land, for resources, and for power. Soon these two fires would merge into one global conflagration. The final line was crossed on September 1st, 1939. Under the cover of a false pretext, German forces stormed across the border into Poland. They unleashed a new kind of warfare they called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Tanks, planes and infantry moved with terrifying speed and coordination, overwhelming the Polish defences. This time there would be no more appeasement. Britain and France, honouring their alliance with Poland, delivered an ultimatum to Germany. When it went unanswered, they declared war. The uneasy peace of the 1930s was shattered. The Second World War had begun. The world would never be the same again. The war quickly divided the world into two great opposing forces. On one side were the Axis powers. This was a military alliance forged in steel and ideology. Its primary members were Germany, under the iron fist of Adolf Hitler, Italy, led by the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, and the Empire of Japan, guided by its military leaders and Emperor Hirohito. These nations were bound by a shared ambition for expansion and a rejection of the existing world order. They believed in their right to conquer their neighbors and build vast empires. They sought to reshape the world map according to their own designs, a world where their power would be absolute and unchallenged. Opposing them were the Allied powers. At the start, this alliance was led by Great Britain and France. They were soon joined by the countries of the British Commonwealth, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. For a time, they stood nearly alone against the Axis onslaught in Europe. The Soviet Union, initially neutral after signing a non-aggression pact with Germany, was thrust into the Allied camp when Hitler betrayed the agreement and invaded its territory in June of 1941. The vastness of Russia and the resilience of its people would become a critical factor in the war. The alliance was a diverse group, united not by a single ideology, but by a common enemy. For 2 long years, the United States watched from the sidelines. The memory of World War I was still fresh, and a powerful isolationist sentiment swept the nation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the danger the Axis posed, but he had to move cautiously. He provided aid to the Allies through programs like the Lend-Lease Act, making America the arsenal of democracy. He sent supplies, guns, planes and ships to Britain and the other Allied nations, helping them keep up the fight. America was not yet in the war, but it was not truly neutral. It had chosen a side, and its industrial might was beginning to stir. The moment that changed everything came on a quiet Sunday morning. On December 7th, 1941, the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack was devastating. It crippled the American fleet and killed thousands. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed a stunned nation, calling it a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. In response, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The conflicts in Europe and Asia were now fused. The war was truly global, a world divided, with nations great and small forced to choose a side. The early years of the war belonged to the Axis. Germany's Blitzkrieg tactics seemed unstoppable. Poland fell in weeks. Then came Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. In the spring of 1940, the unthinkable happened. France, a major military power, was defeated in just 6 weeks. British forces were miraculously evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, but the European continent was now under Nazi domination. Hitler turned his attention to Britain, launching a massive air campaign known as the Battle of Britain. Day after day, German bombers pounded British cities, but the Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, fought with incredible courage and skill, and the invasion was postponed indefinitely. On the other side of the world, Japan's empire was expanding rapidly across the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, they seized the Philippines, Singapore, and vast swathes of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. They seemed invincible. But the tide began to turn in the summer of 1942. At the Battle of Midway, the US Navy, having broken the Japanese naval code, laid a trap. In a single decisive naval battle, American dive bombers sank 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers, the very heart of its fleet. It was a stunning victory that halted Japan's advance. The long and bloody island-hopping campaign to push Japan back to its home islands could now begin. In Eastern Europe, the war reached a scale of brutality never before seen. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was the largest land invasion in history. Millions of soldiers clashed along a front that stretched for over 1,000 miles. The turning point came in the city of Stalingrad. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet armies fought a merciless street-by-street battle in the frozen ruins of the city. The German Sixth Army was surrounded and eventually forced to surrender. The defeat at Stalingrad was a catastrophic blow to the German war machine and to Hitler's prestige. From that point on, the Red Army would begin its relentless push west toward Berlin. The final major turning point came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 150,000 Allied troops, American, British, Canadian and others, landed on the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy, France. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history, a massive gamble to open a Western front and liberate Europe from Nazi control. The fighting was fierce and the casualties were high, especially on beaches codenamed Omaha and Utah. But the Allies established a foothold. They broke out of Normandy and began the long, hard fight across France, pushing the German army back. The fate of the Axis was sealed. The war was now a race to Berlin from both the east and the west. The war was not just fought by soldiers on distant battlefields. It was a total war that reached into every home, every town, and every family. In countries like Britain, civilians were on the front line. During the Blitz, people huddled in air raid shelters or in the subways as bombs rained down on their cities. Children were evacuated from cities to the relative safety of the countryside, separated from their parents for months or even years. Everyone learned to live with rationing. Food, clothing, gasoline, and other essential goods were strictly limited so that resources could be diverted to the war effort. Victory gardens were planted in backyards and parks to supplement the food supply. In the United States, the war effort transformed the nation. Factories that once made cars began producing tanks and planes. The country's immense industrial power was fully unleashed, creating a torrent of war materials that supplied all the Allied nations. This industrial boom pulled the country out of the Great Depression. With millions of men joining the military, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They became welders, riveters, and mechanics, taking on jobs that had once been considered men's work. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter came to symbolize the vital contribution of women to the war effort on the home front. For children, the war was a constant presence. They grew up with blackouts, air raid drills, and maps on the wall showing the progress of the fighting. They collected scrap metal, rubber, and paper for recycling into war materials. They bought war bonds and stamps to help finance the conflict. In newsreels at the movie theater, they saw images of a world at war. For many, their fathers, brothers, and uncles were gone, serving overseas. Every family lived with the fear of receiving a telegram bearing the worst possible news. The war shaped an entire generation, teaching them lessons of sacrifice, resilience, and loss at a very young age. The war also revealed deep-seated prejudices. In the United States, despite fighting for freedom abroad, segregation and discrimination continued at home. African American soldiers served in segregated units. Yet, many, like the famed Tuskegee Airmen, fought with extraordinary distinction, hoping their service would pave the way for greater equality. In one of the country's darkest chapters, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, were forced from their homes and incarcerated in internment camps. They were suspected of disloyalty simply because of their ancestry. The war on the home front was a complex story of unity and division, of immense sacrifice and profound injustice. World War II was a catalyst for technological advancement on an unprecedented scale. The conflict became a desperate race between scientists and engineers to create newer, faster, and more lethal weapons. Air power came to dominate both land and sea. Long-range bombers like the American B-17 Flying Fortress and the British Lancaster could fly deep into enemy territory to destroy factories and cities. Fighter planes evolved at a breathtaking pace. The British Spitfire, the American P-51 Mustang, and the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 dueled in the skies, each new model seeking an edge over the last. The war also saw the dawn of the jet age, with the German Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. On the seas, the aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the most important naval vessel. Battles were no longer fought by ships within sight of each other, but by planes launched from hundreds of miles away. Submarines, particularly Germany's U-boats, prowled the Atlantic, threatening to cut off Britain's vital supply lines. In response, the Allies developed new technologies to hunt them, including improved sonar for detecting them underwater and long-range patrol aircraft to spot them on the surface. The Battle of the Atlantic was a deadly game of cat and mouse, a technological struggle that was just as critical as any land battle. Communication and intelligence were also transformed. The Germans used a sophisticated encryption machine called Enigma to encode their communications. For years, the Allies worked tirelessly to crack it. At a secret facility in Britain called Bletchley Park, a team of brilliant mathematicians and codebreakers, including Alan Turing, finally succeeded. Breaking the Enigma code gave the Allies a priceless advantage. They could read German orders and anticipate their moves, a secret weapon that shortened the war and saved countless lives. Radar, another critical invention, allowed the Allies to detect incoming enemy aircraft from far away, giving them precious time to scramble their fighters. The most profound and terrifying technological development was born out of a secret project in the deserts of New Mexico. The Manhattan Project brought together some of the world's greatest scientific minds to unlock the power of the atom. They were driven by the fear that Nazi Germany might develop such a weapon first. Their work culminated in the creation of the atomic bomb, a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. This invention would not only bring the war to its ultimate conclusion, but would also usher in a new, more dangerous age for all of humanity, forever changing the nature of conflict and international relations. By the spring of 1945, the end was in sight in Europe. The Allied armies were closing in on Germany from all sides. The Soviets were pushing from the east, the Americans, British, and their allies from the west. German cities lay in ruins from years of relentless bombing. The Nazi war machine was collapsing. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops fighting their way into the heart of Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. He refused to face the humiliation of defeat. A few days later, on May 7th, what remained of the German High Command unconditionally surrendered. The next day, May 8th, was declared Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, sparking massive celebrations in cities across the Allied world. But while the war was over in Europe, the fight in the Pacific raged on. The Japanese military, driven by a code of honor that forbade surrender, continued to fight with fierce determination. The American island hopping campaign had been incredibly costly. Battles on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa resulted in horrific casualties on both sides. American military planners feared that a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. President Harry S. Truman, who took office after Roosevelt's death, was faced with a terrible decision. He had a new weapon, the atomic bomb, which had been successfully tested in July. He believed that using it could force Japan's surrender and avoid the bloody invasion. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In an instant, the city was obliterated and tens of thousands of people were killed. 3 days later, with the Japanese government still debating its next move, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki with similarly devastating results. The world had entered the nuclear age. Faced with this unimaginable power and a declaration of war from the Soviet Union, Emperor Hirohito finally intervened. He spoke to his people by radio for the first time ever, announcing that Japan must bear the unbearable and accept the terms of surrender. On August 15, 1945, the fighting stopped. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. After 6 long and brutal years, World War II was finally over. The world was at peace, but it was a peace overshadowed by the dawn of a new and terrifying era, defined by the very weapon that had ended the war. The end of the war did not mean a return to the world that had existed before. The conflict had fundamentally reshaped the global landscape. The old European empires of Britain and France were exhausted, their economies shattered and their colonial power diminished. In their place, 2 new superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had been wartime allies, but their deep ideological differences, American democracy and capitalism versus Soviet communism, quickly turned them into rivals. The world entered a new period of tension and mistrust known as the Cold War, a standoff between 2 nuclear-armed giants that would last for decades. The sheer scale of the war's destruction was difficult to comprehend. More than 60 million people were dead. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Economies were in ruins. In the aftermath, the world learned the full, horrifying extent of the Holocaust. The Nazis had systematically murdered 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, Slavs, Roma, political prisoners, and homosexuals, in a state-sponsored genocide. The discovery of the concentration camps like Auschwitz and Dachau shocked the conscience of the world. In response, the Nuremberg trials were held to prosecute Nazi leaders for war crimes, establishing the principle that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. In an effort to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again, the nations of the world came together. In 1945, they founded the United Nations, an international organization dedicated to maintaining peace and security and fostering cooperation among nations. It was a successor to the failed League of Nations, but this time it was given more power and included all the major world powers. The war also spurred the creation of new international economic institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, designed to promote global economic stability and prevent the kind of economic collapse that had contributed to the rise of fascism. The legacy of World War II is still with us today on this day, June 16, 2025. It serves as a powerful and somber reminder of humanity's capacity for both incredible cruelty and extraordinary courage. It reminds us of the dangers of unchecked aggression, of hatred, and of indifference. The stories of the soldiers who fought, the civilians who endured, and the victims who perished are a vital part of our collective memory. Remembering the war is not just about studying history. It is about honoring the sacrifices of a generation and recognizing our shared responsibility to work for a world where such a devastating conflict can never happen again.